On the Divine Happiness, Discourse 18 of Discourses on Various Subjects, Volume 1, by John Leland. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 15, quote, "Who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords," end quote. Great and worthy conceptions of the Supreme Being lie at the foundation of all religion, and accordingly it is one great excellency of the sacred writings that they everywhere abound with the most just and admirable descriptions of the Deity and of His incomparable glory and perfection, than which nothing can have a happier tendency to engage us to adore and worship, to serve and to obey Him, and to fill us at once with an ardent superlative love to Him, and with a profound awe and reverence of His infinite majesty. A remarkable instance of this we have in these words of St. Paul, in which he represents God as, quote, "the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen or can see, to whom be honour and power everlasting. Amen." End quote. What a grand and sublime description of the Deity is this! It is the first part of it that I shall now particularly consider, in which God is represented as, quote, "the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords." End quote. There are two things which are here plainly signified: the divine happiness and the divine dominion. The first is signified in the character of, quote, "blessed," end quote, which is here given. The second is signified by his being called, quote, "the only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords," end quote. I shall distinctly consider each of these. First, let us consider the perfect happiness of the Supreme Being, which is signified by the epithet, quote, "blessed," end quote, by which he is here described. In the New Testament there are two words used in the original concerning God, both which are rendered by our translators, quote, "blessed," end quote, though they differ in their signification. The one is eulogetos, and is the word used, Romans chapter 1, verse 25, where God is called, quote, "blessed forever," end quote, and Romans chapter 9, verse 5, and in several other places. And this word, in its proper original meaning, has a relation to the praises ascribed to Him by His intellectual creatures, and signifies that to Him all blessing and praise belongs. The other word which our translators likewise render, quote, "blessed," end quote, but which, to distinguish it from the former, had better be rendered happy, is makarios. And this is designed not so much to signify that He is worthy to be blessed and praised by His creatures, as to signify His own essential felicity, that He is most perfectly happy in Himself. And this is the word used in the text. The first clause of the verse might therefore be properly rendered thus, quote, "the happy and only potentate," end quote. Happiness is so manifestly included in the idea of God that all that have ever owned the being of God have regarded Him as possessed of a perfect felicity. Yet it will not be amiss to inquire a little into the proofs and evidences upon which this principle is grounded, how it appears that God is infinitely happy, and what that happiness is which belongs to Him. This will tend to render that infinitely glorious being very honourable and amiable in our eyes, and to fill us with the highest admiration of Him, as well as to convince us how well fitted He is to make His creatures happy, to be our sufficient happiness as He is His own. First, in general it appears that God must needs be perfectly happy, if we consider that He has an absolute fullness of perfection and excellency in Himself without any possible defect. The highest idea we can form of the most complete felicity is a full and absolute confluence of all possible excellency, perfection, and glory. The more excellent any being is, and the sublimer and more enlarged its faculties and capacities are, its happiness is of the sublimer and nobler kind. Thus, the happiness of a man, when he acts up to the true end of his being, is greater and of a nobler nature than that of a brute, and of an angel than that of a man. And as God is infinitely more perfect than the highest angels, so his happiness is of as much an higher kind as the excellency of his nature is superior to theirs, i.e., in an infinite degree. The lowest kind of happiness is the sensitive. Above this rises the rational and human. Above this the angelical, but above all the divine. Whatever there is of excellency, felicity, and joy in the whole universe is derived from God, and in him is contained and summed up. He comprehends it all eminently in himself, and infinitely more. By enjoying himself, therefore, he enjoys all that is great and good, glorious and happy. For where there is an infinite fullness of all possible perfection, there is no room for any farther desires. Since nothing is deficient, nothing can be added. This boundless perfection of the divine nature must needs be a source of the most perfect complacency and joy to his infinite mind. Where there is infinite power, wisdom, goodness, righteousness, truth, and all other perfections, in the highest degree of eminency, and in the most amiable and perfect harmony, how sublime and complete must the happiness resulting from this be? With what perfect delight and self-approbation must he contemplate his own peerless excellencies, especially as he is the great original of moral goodness and beauty, comprehending in himself all that is lovely, just, and pure. He is infinite, essential life. Quote, with him is the fountain of life, end quote. Psalm 36, verse 9. He is pure eternal light. For we are told, quote, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all, end quote. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. No darkness of ignorance, error, or impurity. He is infinite love, goodness itself. Quote, God is love, end quote. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. And love is a fountain of delight. Now therefore, since God is infinite life and light and love, he must needs be his own infinite happiness and joy. But secondly, I add as a farther illustration of the divine happiness, that he hath all this felicity eternally, unchangeably, independently, as from everlasting to everlasting he is God, unchangeably possessed of all perfections, so from everlasting to everlasting he is absolutely and unchangeably happy. As he is equally perfect at all times, so he is at all times equally, that is, infinitely happy. And as he can never, in any part of duration, or in any possible circumstance of things, be rendered less perfect, so he can never be less happy than he always is. He does not in the least depend on anything without him for his being or for his perfections, and consequently does not depend on anything without him for his happiness, nor can suffer the least diminution from it, or receive the least accession to it. The creation of this visible world, the existence of angels and men, made no alteration in God's own proper happiness, any more than in his essence or perfection. He was infinitely happy in himself before there was any creature formed. And though we should suppose this vast universe with all the orders of beings in it to be annihilated, still would the happiness of God continue unchangeably the same, since he would still be the same infinitely perfect and glorious being, having a boundless fullness of perfection and excellency in himself. This leads me to add, thirdly, that God is forever exalted above everything that might be supposed to interrupt or disturb his felicity and joy. For nothing can resist his power. He can do whatsoever he pleaseth in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No events can surprise him, which he did not foresee, since he perfectly knows all things from the beginning, and therefore can never properly meet with a disappointment. There is no necessity or fate which binds him, none but what flows from the most free and wise resolves of his most perfect mind, whereby he ordereth all things according to the counsel of his own will. No uneasy passions or perturbations can possibly have place in his infinite mind. It does not disturb his happiness in the least that he governs this vast world, and all the orders of things in it. Hence he is here justly called, quote, the blessed, end quote, or happy, quote, potentate, end quote, to signify that his universal government does not in any degree interrupt or diminish his perfect felicity. Few earthly kings or potentates can be reckoned in any considerable degree happy. However they appear exalted in power and dignity above others, yet many of their subjects are really happier and enjoy more true satisfaction than they. All the external pomp and magnificence of empire, which dazzles vain mortals, is often only a more splendid kind of misery. The best of princes are often puzzled with emergent difficulties, or take wrong measures through a weakness incident to human nature, or find themselves unable to execute the good designs they had concerted, or are distracted with the multiplicity of affairs. For what a burden must it be for a man to have the cares, not merely of a family, but of a nation upon him. Yet, what is this compared with the care of this vast universe, and all things in it? Accordingly, Epicurus and his followers, who denied a providence, would not allow their deities to concern themselves with the affairs of men, under pretense that this was inconsistent with their happiness. And indeed, it might distract and confound such limited, imperfect deities as these were, whom they professed to acknowledge. But a just view and consideration of the infinite glory and perfections of the Supreme Being would convince us that his government of the world is no way inconsistent with the perfect blessedness he enjoys. As he created heaven and earth, and all things that are therein, quote, by his word, end quote, or, quote, by the breath of his mouth, end quote, as the psalmist expresseth it, Psalm 33, verse 6. So he upholds and governs all things with the same almighty facility with which he created them. As he presides over all the changes of this mutable scene of things, without being himself changed, and over all the motions of this material world, being himself unmovable, so he governs all the passions and perturbations of men, without being affected himself with those passions. All the confusions of this lower world occasion no tumult or commotion in him. He rules them all in perfect, eternal tranquility and unmixed joy, and by his sovereign influence brings light out of darkness, and good out of evil, and maintains the harmony of the whole amidst many apparent jarring contrarieties. No single event happens in the universe but as he orders or permits for wise ends, conformably to the perfect scheme of things, in his infinite, all-comprehending mind. He doeth all things most wisely, most easily, most freely, without anxiety or difficulty, and as his essence fills heaven and earth, and is intimately present at once to every part of this vast creation, so he governs every single creature with as much ease and as much exactness as if he had only that single creature to mind. I add that even the sins of his creatures cannot make him unhappy, or disturb and interrupt his perfect tranquility. There are indeed several passages of Scripture in which God is represented as grieved with the sins of mankind. See particularly Genesis chapter 6 verse 6 and Isaiah chapter 43 verse 24. These are popular ways of speaking in condescension to our infirmity, designed to affect our hearts with a deep sense of the heinous malignity of sin and its contrariety to the holy nature and will of God. This, which is all that is intended by such expressions, is certainly just and true, but they are not to be taken in the strict literal sense, as if it were in the power of wicked men or devils by their most direful blasphemies or their most malicious opposition to his authority and laws, really to grieve and disturb their Maker, or to diminish his essential felicity. In this sense, that observation of Elihu must be acknowledged to be just. Quote, if thou sinnest, what doest thou against him? Or if thy transgressions be multiplied, what doest thou unto him? End quote. Job chapter 35 verse 6. But here it is proper to obviate a perverse inference that some persons of profaned minds have drawn from this principle, that God is infinitely happy. They have argued that therefore there can be no great harm in sinning against God, nor will he severely punish it, since it cannot hurt him, nor do him any real prejudice. But this is a most absurd and unreasonable conclusion. It is to argue that because God is infinitely perfect, and consequently infinitely happy, therefore his authority may be contemned, and his laws transgressed with impunity, whereas, on the contrary, it sets the evil of sin in the strongest light, that it is an opposition to the authority and government of the Supreme Lord of all, who is possessed of all possible perfections. Indeed, if God was capable of being rendered uneasy and unhappy, the sins of his creatures would make him so. This is the genuine tendency of sin in its own nature, and if it does not actually produce that effect, no thanks to the sinner. It is not owing to any want of malignity of sin, but to the infinite excellency and perfection of the divine nature. And this very excellency and perfection of God renders the evil of sin more monstrous, which is really an attempt, though an impotent one, against the throne, the authority and government of God, and as such deserves and requires to be punished. If sinners were suffered without control to oppose their corrupt will and appetites to the holy will of the Supreme Universal Lord, to make their own lusts their rule, and to violate his laws with impunity, what but universal confusion would ensue, a boundless licentiousness, an utter subversion of all order. The beautiful symmetry of the moral world would be dissolved. How dismal would the state of things be if there were no supreme governor and judge? And it would be in effect the same if this supreme governor and judge took no care to maintain his authority, and suffered the subjects of his moral government presumptuously to persist in transgressing his laws, without punishing them for their contempt and disobedience. This would look as if he were indifferent to moral good or evil, a notion the most unworthy of God and of his infinite perfection that can possibly be conceived. But far be it from us to entertain such injurious thoughts of God. As sure as it is that he is the wise and righteous Lord and Governor of the world, so certain it is that he will act in a manner suitable to that relation and character, and therefore will maintain the majesty of his government and the authority of his laws. And this cannot be done without inflicting due punishments on the obstinate, presumptuous transgressors. As he is an eternal lover of order, of that which is just and pure, and virtuous and lovely, so he hath a fixed detestation of moral evil, which is the most manifest breach of all order, the most contrary to his own perfection and purity, and which tends to bring confusion and misery upon the creation of God. And therefore both the immutable rectitude and holiness of his nature, and his regard to the universal good and happiness of his creatures, will engage him to do all that is proper for him as a righteous governor, to stop the spreading of moral evil, by denouncing and executing his just judgments against it. I would conclude this discourse concerning the divine happiness with this reflection, that since God is the blessed or happy potentate, we may hence see of how great importance it is to seek for happiness in him, and to secure an interest in his favor. It is vain to expect happiness from the greatest potentates on earth, whose humor is variable, whose favor is precarious, whose life is short and uncertain, whose power is limited, and who are often strangers to true happiness themselves, and therefore incapable of communicating it to others. But God hath a boundless fullness of excellency in himself. He is his own eternal happiness, and is therefore sufficient to be the happiness of his creatures. For certainly an infinite good must be every way sufficient to make finite beings happy. And it is our great comfort that he delighteth in the free communications of his own glory and felicity, and in liberal distributions to his reasonable creatures, except they shut their souls against his heavenly influences, and render themselves unfit for receiving and enjoying his love and favor, by indulging themselves in a course of sin and disobedience. The principal gracious promise of the new covenant is this, quote, I will be a God unto thee, end quote. This every sincere Christian has a right to apply to himself, and there is more comprehended in it than any man is able to express, or any human heart is able to conceive. What enemies are we to our own comfort, in not frequently contemplating the fullness of joy, happiness, and perfection that is in God, and in not reflecting on that gracious promise, whereby he hath engaged to be our God, our portion and felicity, if we will but return and yield ourselves to him through Jesus Christ, by a true and living faith, a sincere repentance and dutiful obedience. We cannot indeed expect the full effect of his promise whilst we continue in this present sinful world. But the time is coming, and that shortly, when that infinitely perfect and happy being shall display his glory and communicate of his fullness to his faithful servants and children, who loved and served him in sincerity here on earth, in such a manner as shall forever ravish their souls, and diffuse joy and gladness through all their faculties and powers. Then shall they behold his face in righteousness, and be perfectly satisfied with his likeness. For with him is the fountain of life, and in his light shall they see light. In his presence is fullness of joy, and at his right hand there are pleasures for evermore. Rejoice therefore in the Lord, O ye righteous, and shout for joy, all ye that are upright in heart. Let the man of real piety and virtue delight himself in the Lord, and in his infinite perfections, even when the world frowns upon him, and his outward circumstances have a dark and uncomfortable aspect. If the Lord is his portion, whatever be his present lot, he shall in the final issue of things be perfectly happy, and may upon good grounds break forth into that rapturous strain of the prophet, quote, although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vine, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat, the flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. End quote. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 17 and 18.